Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Rick Strassman. Rick is Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico. After 20 years of intermission into psychedelic research, he was the first person in the US to perform human research using a psychedelic. He performed groundbreaking work into N N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which he wrote up in his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, which was later made into a documentary by the same name. He's also the author of DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, an autobiographical novel called Joseph Levy Escapes Death. Today, we talk about his hugely influential work into DMT. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I'm here with Rick Strassman. Rick, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, James, for having me.
So you're obviously very well known for your work on DMT, but you've also had a meditation practice for decades. Maybe we could begin with what first got you interested in psychedelics and spirituality in general.
Well, I began developing an interest in the relationship between the psychedelic state and the states resulting from certain types of meditation. In my early 20s, I was going to college on the West Coast in the late 60s, early 70s. And at that time, there was coincidentally the influx of two new reliable means of altering consciousness quite profoundly. These were the psychedelic drugs and Eastern meditation practices. And descriptions of the two states sounded similar in certain respects. Visions and voices and loss of awareness of the body, extreme emotions, new insights into the nature of reality. So I was always a chemistry buff. I always liked chemistry, and I thought there must be some chemical process that was occurring in the brain that was similar to the extent that the two syndromes overlapped. So that started me thinking about, I guess, what might be called the biology of spiritual experience. If you meditate, are certain brain areas activated or are certain chemicals released? And when you trip on LSD, to the extent that it's similar in some ways to meditation, are the same brain areas being turned on? Are the same chemical changes occurring?
Right. And then as a researcher, I guess linking into the whole chemistry buff thing, before studying DMT, you studied melatonin, right?
Yeah. Well, the focus of my interest early on was the pineal gland. This was before people knew much about melatonin and circadian rhythms and things. If you look at charts of esoteric physiology, Kabbalah, the chakras of Hinduism, there's quite a lot of activity at the top of the head, which is a few inches above the location of the pineal gland. The highest states of consciousness are experienced in that location at the top of the head. Well, because there was not much known about the pineal gland in humans, scientifically anyway, it seemed like a good place to start with respect to looking for like a spiritual center in the brain. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It'll be easy to clip out.
Yeah. Well, so at that time, there wasn't that much, known about the role of melatonin in humans. And in fact, there were some preliminary data indicating that it was psychedelic. It's, chemically, related, to serotonin. So it, could, be acting at the same kind of receptors that the psychedelics were. So we started off with an exhaustive study of melatonin in humans. Psychologically, the only thing that we found was that high doses were sedating. From the subjective experience point of view. So in the meantime, I learned about DMT, which is also made in the body and is known to be quite psychedelic. So I turned my attention to working on a DMT study after that.
Right. Yeah. And as you say, they're very chemically related, right? They're all tryptamines, including melatonin. And, thanks to your work, we now know that melatonin is not a psychedelic, but that, you know, now I guess the picture is that it's involved in, as you say, sleep, wake cycles, circadian rhythms. And then you turned your attention, as you say, to DMT, which led to your book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. How did, I mean, you effectively were the first person kind of starting this psychedelic renaissance at that point. How did you, it's quite a bold thing to do, how did you actually get the ball rolling on getting a study like this out there?
Well, the first new study took place in Germany, actually, about a year before ours, and they studied mescaline. But our study was the first new study in the States in a generation. And we studied DMT, and we also studied psilocybin. Most people, I haven't written all that much about our psilocybin work, but we started a psilocybin study as well. Well, it was a long, slow process to get my DMT study off the ground. I moved to New Mexico to work at the university in Albuquerque, for the reason that it was off the radar. It was a small school, but still strong scientifically, and quite libertarian. They let you do what you wanted to do as long as you could, support your arguments, or support your proposal with reasonable arguments. And I started thinking about, doing a human psychedelic, drug research study, or studies, when I was 20 years old. I was in, college. So it was, it was a long-term goal. It was a, dream, which I, kept, burning, or at least, simmering, for a long time, for almost 20 years. And I believed I could do that work more comfortably in New Mexico. I wouldn't be receiving the same kind of media attention. There wouldn't be the scrutiny at the university level that we were stepping into something too controversial. And I was also fortunate in being trained in clinical psychopharmacology research. I spent a year fellowship at UC San Diego. My first, 2 years in New Mexico were on, training funds as well to do the melatonin study. And I, cut my teeth. I became a successful junior clinical researcher. So I was so I was at the right, place at the right time. In anticipation of my DMT or any kind of psychedelic work. I hadn't yet settled on DMT, but in the meantime, during my fellowship, I wrote a chapter for a book on adverse effects of psychedelic drugs, adverse reactions to LSD. Because I knew ultimately at some point I would need to respond to concerns that psychedelics were unsafe, that they couldn't be used safely in humans. So I read 200 papers on on adverse effects to psychedelics, and it was a strong chapter. And my mentors at the time said, "Oh, this could be a standalone scientific paper. Why don't you write it up that way?" So I did, and it was published in 1984. And so that was 4 years before I began the paperwork to do my DMT project, and that paper figured prominently in my discussion of how to manage adverse effects. Can these drugs be given safely? Those kinds of issues. So the science was good. It was impeccable science. It was, based on human pharmacology and the huge advances in animal pharmacology with respect, to the psychedelics. Prozac was, developed, because of studies in animals with LSD, more or less. Serotonin was discovered because of LSD. Um, well, the relationship of, serotonin, to, consciousness, to mental, function, was elucidated by studying LSD. So there was a huge amount of animal data, a large amount of human, data, which had, begun being accumulated during the first wave of studies, but, which halted with these drugs being scheduled in, 1970. So I, basically, said these are the most interesting, drugs in psychiatry. We've not studied them for 20 years in humans, and why not? And these are the questions I want to ask. What receptors, what part of the brain, what are the effects on the heart, on endocrine system, all kind of basic questions. We stayed clear of therapy. We only studied normal volunteers. We stayed clear of mystical states. We just said, this is a clinical psychopharmacology study, dose response work. And I had been, trained in, doing, neuroendocrine, dose response work. My mentor at UNM was a pediatric neuroendocrinologist, not a psychiatrist. So he is like, hardcore, there are hormones, there's the brain, there's the relationship between the two, and you have to be, precise in your thinking. So it was a strong study. It was, it was a straightforward and strong study. Just, kind of, meat and potatoes. So the study got, funded. I had, 2 grants, before I even, possessed DMT. The war on, drugs, the National Institutes of Health, supported the work, and the Scottish Rite Foundation of the Masons supported the work. So the main, problem was to get the DMT. And, that was a, 2-year process of working with, federal, regulators and, the DEA and the FDA. So, once I, found someone, Dave Nichols at Purdue, that wanted to make, or was agreeable to make DMT, it just was a, back and forth, just all these phone calls and paperwork and things like that. And we, finally, got, the drug. It was approved, and we began the study in late 1990.
Right. And then the study involves, right, healthy participants receiving DMT intravenously, right? And then you're kind of documenting their experiences, right? And you mentioned in DMT, this very molecule, that you were kind of expecting these kinds of enlightenment type unitive mystical experiences. Is that right? That's what both you and the participants were expecting?
Yeah. The spiritual scaffolding that I brought to bear, or the perspective, was from Zen Buddhism. I was interested in, drugs, psychedelics, but I was also interested in meditation. And I learned, or I started studying under the supervision of a Zen monastery in 1974. 14 years before I started, well, I guess, 16 years, before I gave my first dose of DMT. So I was steeped in that model, steeped in, the tradition of, Kensho, Satori, enlightenment, parinirvana, nirvana. And, the scripture of great wisdom, the Heart Sutra, there's no form, feeling, perception, consciousness, or understanding. So it's a completely empty state. It's full of potentiality, I suppose. But otherwise it's empty. It's there isn't anything actual in there, other than a lot of actual potential. But still, it's the merging. You're merged with the source, the sustainer of existence. There's no personality, there's no time, there's no space, there's no thought. You're completely subsumed by some wordless state or force. Um, so I was expecting that. I figured if we gave enough DMT, that would be the default peak experience. And many of my volunteers were meditators as well, and were expecting that kind of peak experience. And as it turned out, only one person out of nearly 5 dozen volunteers had that kind of experience. And it's interesting to note that volunteer was a religious studies major in college and was very keen on the mystical unitive experience, and was part of part of a religious organization or group that strove for that kind of experience, and so he was the only person who had, I guess, what you would call a classical mystical unitive effect. Everything else was interactive. It was full of content. The beings in there, the energy, the intelligence in the state itself was it was other. It was something else and very real. And people maintained their personalities and their ability to interact, ask questions, receive answers, direct their attention here and there. So it in a way was the opposite of what both they and I expected.
Right. And it seems a reasonable thing to predict that, given that psilocybin, we now know, in clinical studies, produces these mystical unitive experiences, and psilocybin is incredibly closely related to DMT structurally, right? Like I've heard several people say that it's like orally active DMT. It's just one hydroxy group different. And but then, as you say, these DMT experiences are anything but empty of content, right? They're incredibly intense and rich and spatial, and a lot of things are happening. Would you be able to kind of sketch out some of the kind of maybe even like a prototypical DMT experience to someone who has no idea of this terrain, or just some of the main themes?
Sure. Yeah. But first, I'd like to address your point about psilocybin inducing mystical experiences. The mystical unitive state. The two compounds are quite closely related. So in a way, it's DMT with a hydroxy group is psilocin, which is the active metabolite of psilocybin. But the frequency or the prevalence or the high incidence of the mystical unitive state in the current parlance, especially emanating from the Hopkins research group, is a function of the set and the setting. It isn't a property of the drug per se. The drug itself is working on the person's mind, the person's psyche. And in those studies, they do 10 to 12 hours of preparatory psychotherapy. It's also education, though. It's education which teaches about the mystical experience and its utility and how wonderful it is. And if you attain a mystical experience, all kinds of good things will happen to you. And that's the goal of our work in the drug state. So they're prepared. They're indoctrinated in a way. They're, trained, to recognize and encourage the mystical experience, and they're informed of its great, value and esteem. So in the drug state, you're instructed to react to the experience in a certain manner that will optimize the outcome that you're looking for, which is a mystical state. For example, if you're in a tight spot, during your psilocybin experience, there's a couple of ways of dealing with that. One is to let be, let go. You approach it passively, which encourages ego dissolution, lack of volition. But you could also respond to being in a tight space through prayer. You could pray for help to God or to, the equivalent, in which case the experience may be entirely, differently, because you're reacting to the drug experience in a totally different way. And we all know that our drug experiences are dependent on our responses to them. So if you treat one set of experiences passively, and you treat the same set of experiences more actively, the experience may be completely different. If you're praying in your tight corner there, you might be answered, in which case you begin interacting with the content of the state. If you just let go, let be, you're just kind of expanding into some nameless, formless thing. It isn't an interaction. You're giving up volition. You're giving up your personality. So that's the acute drug state is set up to have a mystical experience. And then finally integration. Integration is perceived through this theological psychology that's a mishmash of Vedanta, New Age, Christianity, about all is one, things are relative. It's more of the let be, let go, but it could have a completely different way of interpreting it. Like, okay, you encountered this thing in your drug experience yesterday, and you interacted, and it interacted with you, and you with it. What did it say, and what do you get out of that, and how do you understand that, and how will you develop the ideas that came to you in that drug state in the future? So that's a completely different way of integrating and interpreting the drug state as well. So to think that drugs possess inherent effects. Psychedelics are not inherently spiritual, and they certainly aren't, and mystical. Inherently, they're just drugs, and they're working on your mind. So they, you wouldn't, be having that kind of experience if it weren't, your personality, for your background, for all of the 12 hours of education that you've gotten about what to anticipate. So they're inherently neither good nor bad, mystical or prophetic, useful or not. It's all depending on who you are, your intention, the intention of those around you. Yeah, so that's my long-winded diatribe against kind of pigeonholing these drugs as possessing specific effects that are that are that are invariant.
Right.
They're just drugs.
I'm really glad you made that point because, as you say, the trip isn't in the drug, right? The drug's just a physical thing. And I think you're really right that with psilocybin, it's this slow release thing, which gives you the opportunity to go in the direction of surrendering and dissolving into everything. Or you can also go in the direction of engaging in this interactive way, as you say. And it's known that, at very high doses, a psilocybin trip can be very much like a DMT experience, very interactive. And on the other hand, if you slow down the DMT experience with ayahuasca, people seem to have more of these unitive experiences. So I think that's really, useful to think about this psychological landscape that you've kind of laid out. And it makes sense as well that with, the kinetics of, vaporized and inhaled DMT as people widely use it, or intravenously injected as you did in your study, we're talking about 10 minutes, 20 minutes maybe of an experience that comes over you very fast in a situation where I think it's probably hard to surrender. So while there may be the potential for a unitive kind of surrendering approach, I think that almost the kinetics of it, the dynamics makes it quite hard to probably pushes it in the direction of interaction.
Well, yeah, I agree. Yeah, but I think it's, more of, what you want to get out of it. You know, you can dissolve into the DMT state. I mean, our one volunteer did, but it's more difficult, phenomenologically, because the phenomenology of the DMT state, which we will discuss, is quite colorful, quite interactive. It's full of stuff. 5-methoxy DMT, it's pharmacology, or it's phenomenology is slightly different. It is more prone to giving you the white light experience. But even that isn't invariant. The first time I smoked 5-methoxy DMT, it was my first encounter with the beings. I mean, the place was loaded with these little dwarves. So that was 5-methoxy DMT, and the other people in the room smoked it, and it was the white light kind of thing. So I think certain drugs lend themselves to certain phenomenology, but what you do with that phenomenology depends on you. So you could be in the white light and you can start to pray. You wouldn't have to just hang out in the white light. And from the biblical perspective, the white light would be what you would call God's glory. It isn't God. You can't really perceive God. I mean, God's imperceptible. But you could see reflections of God, or God's backside, as it were. And one of those manifestations is called glory, kavod, which also means serious or heavy or weighty. It can also mean liver, like your liver. So that's an interesting etymology. But kavod, kavod is God's glory, and it's the white light. In a lot of ways. And you can interact with kavod. I mean, you can interact with God's glory. You could ask it questions. You could pray. You could, glorify it. You can argue with it. You can ask for help from it. So even in the white light case, you don't, necessarily, need to dissolve into it. You can, parse it out a little more interactively.
Right. And so, as you kind of hinted to, you've made this really useful distinction between this unitive experience where there's, the subject and the objects of the world, and then there's a kind of a combining of the two, a kind of melting into each other. And then there's the DMT state, which kind of lends itself more often to this interactive relational experience, as you called it, where your sense of self is very much intact and there's all this content and that you're interacting with. So yeah, maybe you could give us a bit of an outline of what a DMT experience might be like.
Yeah, sure. I guess I should describe, the setting in which volunteers receive DMT. It was a hospital room, pretty stark, on a clinical research unit, which also was, doing a lot of experimental cancer chemotherapy research. So it was a pretty serious place. Volunteers were normal volunteers. We screened them for any for any psychological or any medical problems. They were all experienced with psychedelics. Only a small number of them had used DMT before. This was the late 80s, early 90s. And it was still a pretty unknown drug. That was changing with Terence McKenna's work, but still it was relatively obscure compared to now. And as I was saying early on, it was just a clinical psychopharmacology study. And we told volunteers, not that much. I described it as fast onset, short duration, fast offset, and you may feel as if you've left your body, and as a result, you might be afraid that you've died. But don't worry, nobody's died, and we have a code team on call at all times. So that kind of was the bare bones preparation. I mean, it wasn't like, well, there's this thing called a mystical experience that dates back to the Vedas, and it's like, okay, this is DMT. It's very strange. It's very fast. Don't be afraid. Be calm. Before I inject the drug, and just keep your wits about you, and observe and just do your thing in there, and then come back and describe it to us. So that's that was the set and setting. Most of the volunteers in the first set of studies were friends. So they knew me, I knew them, we trusted each other. And they had been standing in line for 2 years to participate in the study. So during that time, we kind of worked out an agreement, like, you'll be going into this state, and it's important to remember as much as you can, and we'll talk about it afterwards. So they had 2 IVs in place, one in each arm, rectal thermistor, like a skinny wire, to measure temperature, and a blood pressure cuff. So they couldn't really move. They were strapped in. And at first, when I would describe the setting to them, when they would, come in, to my office, and we'd start talking about the study, like a month or two in advance, I would, describe the environment in the hospital. And at first they would be kind of leery. It was a fraught description, but after they thought about it, and especially at the time of the study itself, they were glad that they couldn't move, because it helped them just give up resistance. They just were going to surrender to the drug effect. They weren't going to fight it. They weren't going to move around. They weren't going to try and get up and start dancing or something. They were going in deep. I would, walk upstairs, from the, pharmacy in the basement with a, little, syringe of, frozen DMT in my shirt pocket, and would be, thawing out as I'd be running up the stairs. There was, me on one side, and, the nurse on the other side of the bed. They'd be, laying flat, with eye shades, because early on it was just, too distracting if you weren't wearing eye shades, because of the room breaking up visually, and the rush. You really wanted to have your wits about you as the effects began, and if you're looking around disoriented by the onset of the visions, it's difficult to focus. So I would ask them to take a breath, to relax, to tell me when they're ready. Tell me when you're ready. So people would close their eyes and take some breaths and calm themselves. They say, okay, I'm ready. I'd stick the syringe through the diaphragm, and I would begin infusing it over the space of 30 seconds. I would say I've started now, halfway through. Okay, I'm done. Pulling out the drug syringe. Okay, I'm injecting saline now, to clear the line. And over the next 15 seconds. We gave a number of different doses, placebo, small, a couple of medium, and one large. So I'm describing the large effects, the large dose effects. You would start to feel the rush at about after just a couple of heartbeats. there would be an inner sensation of anxiety and acceleration, pressure, inner pressure. And it was very important to stay, calm, during that 15, 30-second rush, because it was quite powerful. With eyes closed, there would be the appearance of, rapidly, moving, morphing, kaleidoscopic, heavily pixelated, visual imagery. Frequently, not always, but fairly often, there was a buildup of a high-pitched sound. So the rush and the sound would kind of climax at about 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and you would be catapulted or find yourself or propelled into this this world of light, space full of light, black space, full of light, and it was quiet. It started off with that high-pitched crescendoing there'd but once you were there, it was utterly silent. You couldn't hear anything. Well, you were functionally deaf. There'd be stuff going outside in the hall, and volunteers would just be lying there completely oblivious. The first couple of blood pressure checks with that automated cuff, which exerts quite the grip. People were completely unaware of the 2-minute reading and usually unaware of the 5-minute reading. So they were moribund, at least to the eye. So these visual images could coalesce into definable discernible figures, insects, reptiles, plants, statuettes, robotic things, birds, any number of discrete objects, and we ended up calling those things the beings. But even if there weren't beings, there was still this sense of intelligence and of power in that state, even if it may not be localized to a specific thing that you could see. So there'd be interactions between the beings and you, between the state and you. The feelings were full. Whether to call them blissful or ecstatic, it would be a little difficult to characterize them. It was more of fullness. The peak effect like that, where you're hanging out in that space at maximal intensity, might be about 5 minutes, 7 minutes at the most, maybe 10 minutes. But still, it's a pretty busy time, and most volunteers were amazed it was only 10 minutes. They would, they felt it was half hour, 3 hours, and a much longer period of time, than actually elapsed. So they'd start coming down around 20 minutes after the injection. They'd be able to start, moving around, flexing their hands, extending their fingers, feeling themselves kind of return back into their bodies. And at the half-hour point, almost everybody, was straight, was, sober, talking. Within another 10 minutes or so, they'd be drinking tea, filling out rating scales. The time course corresponded to the levels of DMT in blood, which were peak at 2 minutes and at 5 minutes, and then began to precipitously drop after that, and were basically non-detectable at the 30-minute point. People would start feeling functional again, and start describing their experiences. We'd spend another half hour, maybe an hour, talking about what happened, and I would be taking notes and transcribe them later.
So the experience has this feeling of feeling more real than real, like you're perhaps connecting with some kind of divine reality. And this has this connection to near-death experiences, right? Where when some people, when they're near death, they experience this kind of going down a tunnel, interacting with divine beings in another place that feels real. And you've made this connection in your work, right, between DMT and the near-death experience.
Right. Well, I think when you refer to the beings or even the state, I'm not sure I would call it divine. I would call it, previously invisible. That's a little more generic, a little more neutral. Divine, divining, spirituality, foretelling, God, those kinds of things. Those are kind of loaded. But you can't argue with fact. That what you are witnessing was previously invisible. So that can include a whole spectrum of mechanisms or etiologies or bases of the experience. It could be completely physical, like your brain's been turned into a telescope of some sort or a microscope. And it exists in the physical world, just like energy or fields exist in the physical world, external to us. Because of the effects of the drug on your mind, brain consciousness, you're now able to perceive levels of external reality that you couldn't before. It also includes, or it also, if you call these experiences previously invisible, it also can subsume purely brain generated etiologies, your brain on drugs, certain areas of your cortex are have been stimulated by 2A receptors and things like that. So it also can subsume psychological mechanisms. It's unconscious. It's your unconscious becoming conscious. So you're previously invisible, I think, captures the whole spectrum of what might be going on. One of the, theories that I had when I went into, to the research was that, to the extent that the DMT experience, of, giving, DMT, replicated or mimicked certain features of the near-death experience, that one could argue for a role of naturally occurring DMT in the NDE. So it was, one of those things. I was, talking earlier about the one mystical experience occurring in the one volunteer who really wanted a mystical experience, and he had studied it and was a religious studies major, was, working up, toward it for 20 years. The one volunteer whose DMT effect was the closest to an NDE was a nurse who was fascinated by the NDE. She had been studying it, reading books about it, interviewing people, was hoping for an NDE as a result of getting a big dose of DMT. So she was the only person in the study who went through, a tunnel. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. There were beings on either side, good ones and bad ones. I think it points to the fact that what you bring to the drug experience determines the drug experience itself. So it still is an interesting model, the whole idea of the DMT relationship to the near-death state. In my DMT book, I lay out a stress model of DMT release from the pineal gland at the time of death. That was reported. Actually, there were studies that came out of the University of Michigan, Jimo Borjigan and John Dean, a couple of years ago. Well, in 2013 at first, indicating DMT in the living mammalian pineal gland. So that supported my thinking about DMT in the pineal, and then 6 years later, the same group published some work demonstrating that the brain makes DMT, and maybe not the pineal. And brain levels of DMT increase by 3 to 5 times in the dying rodent brain. And the levels of DMT increase the most in the visual cortex of the dying animal. So that, points, to an interesting, correlation anyway, or an interesting association. If you think about the highly visual characteristics of the near-death experience, it could be a result at least of, or partially at least, of elevated levels of DMT in visual cortex. It's interesting as well because DMT is neuroprotective and neurostimulating. It enhances neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, reduces stroke, size in experimental animals. So if you think about brain injury, either as you're dying or from a stroke, requiring homeostatic mechanism being kicked into place, to heal or to at least slow damage. DMT is a good compound, and just by the way, DMT is incredibly psychedelic. So it starts, it starts to tie together a number of loose ends about what's the role of DMT in the body, and what is the role of DMT in unusual states of consciousness.
Right. Yeah, and the work you mentioned is really fascinating. To see that there's strong evidence that there's DMT in the human brain, and yeah, I guess it's still not settled as to what it's doing in there, but plenty of interesting ideas. And when you first proposed the idea of the pineal producing DMT, you mentioned that it was kind of a nice way to tie together all this esoteric literature, on the pineal, and including Descartes' idea of this kind of the soul interacting with the material world through the pineal as well seems to fit nicely with that, especially with the idea of a soul leaving the body at death, and DMT being some kind of tied up in that in some way. But in the book, you're very clear that it's a kind of speculative hypothesis, but it seems that in the culture at large, in this kind of psychedelic culture, it's really the pineal meme has taken on a life of its own. And you see people kind of, repeating kind of, scientists know for a fact that DMT is produced in the pineal, and then you get all this other kind of conspiracy theory stuff. What's your take on the life of its own that it's taken on?
Well, you can't control what people do with what you write. So I learned that at a certain point. Graham St. John is a Brit. I think he's in Switzerland, now, and has, written about, DMT as a, cultural meme. And he's got a, chapter on the pineal and, DMT. We, went back and forth in the chapter, or, in writing the chapter, or him writing the chapter about the DMT's, pineal connection, which I started back then. I get a lot of emails from people, saying my pineal gland is overactive. I'm, tripping out all the time, or I'm, decalcifying my pineal by, dental flossing my nose, and all kinds of things. That 2013 paper indicated that there was DMT in rodent pineal, but it actually probably is the case, at least in that study, that the probe that went in and out to get to the pineal gland snagged some brain tissue on its path, and it was your brain DMT, which was being measured or being detected. But I'm completely okay with the fact that the pineal may not make DMT. The fact that the brain does is even more intriguing. And even if the experience of, whatever spiritual states occur around the area of the pineal, that, doesn't mean it's the pineal gland on itself, which is, being stimulated. Um, yeah. The question of the DMT in the brain is interesting because the concentrations are as high as those for the canonical neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. So there's are questions and studies being done to answer the question, or to provide answers regarding is there a DMT neurotransmitter system? Is DMT a neurotransmitter just like serotonin or like dopamine? And if that turns out to be the case, that'll be a very strange thing to consider. What is the role of a DMT neurotransmitter system? Um, neurotransmitters are responsible for consciousness, like everyday ongoing consciousness, our mood, our thinking, our awareness of the inner and outer world. So yeah, talk about ontological, well, talk about epistemological questions. I guess ontological ones too. It's going to raise some some rather thorny issues. Terence McKenna used to say, or bemoan, or rue the fact that DMT was not on the front pages of the New York Times. That there's this chemical DMT with that within a few heartbeats it takes you someplace completely else that feels more more real in everything around us. And we don't know, what it is doing in the human brain. But I think gradually, the word is getting out about DMT. That it is in the brain and it has got these effects. Stimulates the growth of nerve cells. I mean, that's pretty exciting. Decalcifying, the pineal gland can't be done. That's just an urban myth. And calcified so calcified pineal glands occur with age. Fluoride increases pineal calcification. That's true. But the calcification may not occur in the melatonin producing cells, the pineal cells themselves. The calcification may occur more in the connective tissue, the stroma, the microglia, those kinds of things, rather than the hormone or neurotransmitter effects or activities of pineal cells proper. So it isn't like the calcium is killing the pineal gland. It's just kind of stiffening up the cartilage around it. And people say, oh, I'm producing more DMT than normal. We cannot really measure very accurately levels of DMT in the blood or the urine. So concentrations concentrations might be increasing in the brain at certain times, but we just don't know. And when people tell me that they're producing more DMT, I have a standard answer, which is to the extent that non-drug states resemble those brought on by giving DMT, it makes sense that naturally occurring DMT is playing a role, but we just don't know. Concentrations of the drug or of the compound are quite low, but we are now able to measure activity of the genes and the enzymes which are responsible for synthesizing DMT. So that may turn out to be how we measure the activity of the DMT system, rather than through measuring levels of DMT itself.
Right. Yeah, and I completely agree with the sentiment that it's so it's such a shocking experience that you kind of do have this feeling of how is this not the thing that everyone's talking about? how has this been kind of kept a secret? And I guess that does lend itself to kind of conspiratorial thinking that it's kind of been actively kept a secret. I don't think there's no reason to believe that. And but this kind of feeling of the reality of the experience. I mean, you describe in the book kind of winding down the studies out of a sense of kind of feeling like you didn't really know what you were playing with. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. We can get to that, but I'm interested in the conspiratorial part. How might the lack of discussion of DMT be part of a conspiracy? Because I wonder, what's going on here.
You mean you think there might be some conspiratorial aspect?
No, I mean, there could be, but you were, raising the conspiratorial issue. Are there conspiracy, theories out there on why
yeah.
people aren't
I mean,
talking about DMT more?
I personally don't believe, but I'm under the impression that when you see people talking about making the connection between fluoride in the water, calcification of the pineal producing DMT,
Oh, right.
there seems to be a kind of a meme that's going around of the government or whoever wants to mind control us is trying to suppress our DMT because DMT is the key to our kind of spiritual essence, or that kind of where you're just making all these connections without really a rigorous evidence, especially the pineal link.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I see. Yeah, but still, I mean, I wonder why people aren't, talking about it more. There's the whole, pineal calcification thing, and fluoride, but that I think is peripheral, to the underlying assumption which fuels that conspiracy, which is we produce DMT in our body, and so the whole question, you can't really calm conspiracies with facts, because then the conspiracies just change to incorporate the objections to them. But I think you can sidestep it by pointing to the fact that there is DMT in the brain, not necessarily in the pineal gland.
Yeah, I mean, my personal take,
I've got some ideas about why. Yeah, I've got some ideas about why people aren't talking about DMT more. One reason is it's completely weird, and it just would be very hard to introduce into public discourse. It just would be too weird. It'd be people wouldn't know what you were talking about, without having had that experience, or at least hearing about that experience. And most people haven't. Number two is that besides being weird, the implications are incredibly troubling. It throws into question the basis of reality. Is this just an ongoing DMT vision that we're all living in? And most people don't want to really think about that. And thirdly, its characterization, well, from a scientific point of view, from a PR point of view, from a how to change your mind point of view, it stands outside of current discourse about psychedelic drugs. Psychedelic drugs are a gateway into being happy, being fulfilled, not being anxious, not being depressed, feeling well, being cured, being healed. So DMT is kind of, that's really, not what's going on with DMT. It isn't like a new antidepressant or a new anti-addiction drug. It's, DMT that thrusts you into this very strange place. So, the New York Times will be a lot more comfortable, talking about, rating scale scores for pain and depression and opiate use improving, than they are about, people's DMT experiences. So I think, because of, those reasons, it isn't part of the mainstream, discourse, but it's increasingly, part of the, psychedelic, drug discourse. And, scientifically as well, science, marches on. There are increasing amounts of data, regarding the role and function of DMT.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. My take on that, I think, is that we live in a culture that's so focused on, so values ordinary, everyday waking consciousness, where we can be productive and, take part in society in that specific way, that mainstream culture seems to have a deep hostility to altered states in general. Because we're supposed to kind of stay in our lane and keep trudging along. And so it's a minority of people who engage with altered states in the first place. And then where they're taken to be, when they're moved into the mainstream, it's when they are valuable for that mode of productivity. So with meditation, it's all about reduce your stress, be more effective at work. We see kind of corporate mindfulness, this kind of thing. And as you say, DMT is kind of, go and visit some strange alien landscape for a while, come back down, and some people have therapeutic benefit, but compared to other psychedelics, as you say, it's kind of just a strange sightseeing tour through God knows what, you can say your mind, or through, people have different theories about what it is. But and then because it's subjective, our culture has a deep fear of subjectivity, even, I would say. It's only 100 years ago we had behaviorism in psychology and neuroscience, where it's just pretend the mind doesn't exist. It's too subjective, it's too hidden. And so if someone says to you they've had this strange experience, it's far easier just to say, well, they're mentally ill, they've had something strange happen, it was an odd drug experience, there's nothing of value here, let's get on with our lives. I think we're seeing it gain traction now because it is so astounding. But I think you're right that it's hard to know what to do with it, really.
Right. It's hard to know what to do with it. But I think that the more people, who consider that question, the more intelligent, the better, and the more well trained, the better. I think we'll start answering it. It could end up being this huge tautology, that or recursion, or something that just really doesn't have a definite stop kind of answer. If DMT is modulating our sense of reality, then what modulates it? So I think it's just this some very difficult to grasp implications. And ultimately, it may not make all that much of a difference. What it's doing in our bodies. The fact is, it is in our bodies, and certain things happen to us, experiences and the like. So we're still living in the world of cause and effect. One of my friends, if she got too stoned, she would slip into the brain in a bottle, delusion, that this was, just like the Matrix. It was a brain in a bottle, that was having this kind of experience. And I used to say to her, what difference does it make? This is our experience. There's cause and there's effect. We still are responsible for the things we do and say and think and feel. So we still ought to try to be good. We ought to still try to avoid doing bad. I think ultimately it wouldn't really make any difference. I suppose for a small cadre of mad scientists who will want to split the veil and end the Matrix, it'll be of interest. But I think practically, it doesn't make all that much difference. It's interesting to think about, like, is there a compound in our brains that regulates our sense of reality? But it's one of those things. If so, so what? This is our reality, and we got to make the most of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I like that grounded kind of approach, where if it turns out that we're in a simulation and we wake up from it when we die, then okay, I'll wait until I die and then I'll be surprised, but I wouldn't have wasted my time playing out my life here. Well, yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Rick. Where can people go if they want to look into your work more?
Well, they can, contact me through my website, rickstrassman.com. And I have Facebook, page. If people want to email me, I'd rather they go through my website. I don't look at Facebook very much, but both of those have got any announcements, uh, podcasts that have just been released, or books, or articles, or news. Yeah, and you can buy books from me on my website. I will inscribe and I will sign them. um, yeah, so I answer almost every email. I've gotten a lot of emails I might not have answered, maybe half a dozen over 20 years, so I'm pretty good at it. uh, yeah, and we can talk about prophecy next time. I would like to pick up where we left off, and I
Yeah,
appreciate you having me
definitely.
on today.
Yeah, no, thank you again. I look forward to chatting again.